The first time she appeared, it was like someone had dropped a tiny comet into the middle of my mundane Tuesday. She was small, impossibly delicate, and somehow radiated a sense of curiosity that made her almost glow. Her skin had a subtle shimmer, a faint iridescence that shifted in the light like oil on water, and her eyes, large, round, and luminescent, tracked every movement I made with a mixture of awe and calculation. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange musical lilt, distorted slightly by the translator device strapped to her chest, which spat out words that sounded adorable, earnest, and just a little bit chaotic. "Why do humans eat that?" she asked first, pointing at my half-eaten sandwich with what I can only describe as a mixture of horror and wonder. I laughed, because there was no way to take her question seriously. "It's food," I said. "You eat it to survive." She nodded as if I had just unlocked some profound mystery, scribbling something on a floating, holographic pad. That was the beginning of what I would soon realize was an all-consuming, adorably chaotic obsession with understanding humans. At first, it was harmless. She followed me around the apartment, tilting her head to study the way I moved, the way I sipped coffee, the way I laughed at the dumbest jokes on TV. "Why do you drink that hot liquid so fast?" she asked one morning, staring in fascination at the steaming mug I was gulping down before work. "It's called caffeine," I said, fumbling for an explanation I knew she wouldn't understand. She tilted her head, her translator beeping as she processed, and then simply copied my movements, lifting the mug in her tiny hands and slurping the liquid with a precision that was both impressive and terrifying. I winced as the hot liquid hit her tongue, but she blinked, scribbled more notes, and shrugged, as if discomfort was just a variable in her data collection. Her fascination didn't stop with food. Furniture was a particular point of intrigue. She inspected every chair, every sofa, and every oddly shaped table as if they were alien artifacts. "Why do humans sit like that?" she asked, pointing at the ergonomic chair I had barely noticed before. She attempted to sit, but did so upside down, balancing precariously on the backrest while still trying to take notes. I laughed and shook my head, trying to demonstrate proper human posture, only to find her trying to imitate me anyway, her legs bent in impossible angles, her arms floating midair as if she were trying to levitate. By the end of the morning, the coffee had spilled, the chair had a dent in it, and I was fairly sure I had lost some dignity, but she looked delighted, scribbling furiously on her holographic pad and muttering things I couldn't quite parse. Her curiosity extended to my personal habits in ways that were endearing and unnerving. She would peek over my shoulder as I typed, tilting her head and humming softly when she didn't understand a word. She asked questions like, "Why do humans type with fingers? Why not tentacles or antennae?" And then proceeded to try typing with her toes, a spectacle that left me both amused and mortified. I tried to explain ergonomics, typing speed, and the general awkwardness of not having hands built for keyboards, but she just nodded, scribbled more notes, and continued her experiments with an unwavering intensity that was part scientific, part, well, adorable chaos. Even my attempts at leisure became events. Watching TV together quickly turned into a lesson in human behavior. She would pause sitcoms, tilt her head at the screen, and ask questions like, "Why do humans laugh at this? What is humorous about clowns?" She mimicked the actors, flailing her arms and twisting her body in ways that made it clear she understood nothing but wanted to understand everything. I explained context, tone, and cultural nuances, but every explanation was a stepping stone to more questions. "And why do humans sometimes touch each other like that?" she asked one evening, eyes wide, pointing at a romantic scene between two actors. My throat went dry, and I coughed, trying to cover my embarrassment, while explaining that some gestures were personal and complicated, and maybe not for demonstration. She scribbled furiously, tilting her head in a way that made it impossible to look away, and asked, "Are these gestures necessary for survival?" I laughed nervously, half in panic, half in awe of her straightforward curiosity. Every day with her was a new chapter of hilarity and gentle chaos. She shadowed me at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, mimicking actions, scribbling notes, and asking questions that made my brain do somersaults. Why do humans eat sandwiches in layers? She asked, tapping her chin. Wouldn't it be more efficient to combine everything in one blob? I tried explaining taste, texture, and aesthetic presentation, but she simply nodded and attempted to roll my sandwich into a perfect sphere, which exploded with mustard and lettuce onto my kitchen counter. She blinked at the mess, scribbled something that looked suspiciously like a formula, and giggled, a high, tinkling sound that was impossible to be annoyed at. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I realized she had taken over my entire living space. Coffee cups, chairs, sandwiches, my half-read books, they were all under scrutiny, tested, measured, and occasionally dismantled. And yet, beneath all the chaos, there was something utterly charming about her obsession. She was earnest, relentless, and adorably naive. Her questions, though sometimes bordering on the invasive, were never mean-spirited. They were pure curiosity, driven by a desire to understand, to learn, and perhaps to connect. The day ended with her perched on my couch, legs crossed in some impossible configuration, staring at me with those luminous eyes. Humans are fascinating, she said, voice melodic, translating roughly as it should. I smiled, shaking my head, exhausted and exhilarated at once. Little did I know, the innocent curiosity that had seemed so adorable would soon escalate into something far more complicated, far more intimate, and far more hilariously chaotic than I could have ever imagined. Her adorable fascination was just the beginning, and I had no idea how wild this ride was about to become. Her fascination with humans quickly moved beyond the mundane into territory that made me simultaneously laugh and cringe. It started subtly at first. She would peek over my shoulder when I checked dating apps, tilting her head at every profile picture and emoji-laden bio as if she were deciphering an alien code. Why do humans post images of themselves in such tiny squares? She asked one evening, her translator buzzing lightly with every word. Are these squares sacred? Do they hold power? I blinked, caught somewhere between amusement and mild panic. It's just a profile picture, I stammered. She scribbled furiously on her floating pad, nodding solemnly, as if my explanation had unlocked an ancient truth. That night, she tried to mimic taking selfies with a level of precision that involved spinning in circles, angling her head in ways that seemed impossible for her anatomy, and accidentally knocking over a lamp in the process. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the minor destruction, and said, I am perfecting human expression for observation purposes. And my laughter died in my throat because she sounded so earnest that I almost believed it. The next day, she began asking questions that made me wish for a translation error that never came. Why do humans wear garments that barely cover their bodies in private? She asked, pointing vaguely toward my laundry basket. I choked on my cereal. Those are just clothes, I said, trying to sound casual. They're for comfort and modesty. She scribbled something that looked suspiciously like a diagram, then tilted her head. And humans find this attractive? She asked, her voice as serious as if she were discussing planetary alignment. I coughed, wishing for any excuse to deflect, but she wasn't going to let it go. She pointed at my socks and tried to examine them, lifting them up and squinting as though she was conducting some intricate human experiment. The combination of her meticulous seriousness and the absurdity of the question made it impossible not to laugh, even as my face burned red. Her misinterpretations escalated quickly. Watching a romantic movie with her became a perilous adventure in awkwardness. In one scene, two characters leaned in to kiss, and she froze midair, floating slightly above the couch in her excitement, eyes wide, fingers splayed. Is this a survival technique? Does it increase chances of reproduction? She asked, scribbling notes frantically. I swallowed hard, trying to explain that humans sometimes kiss to express affection, not for survival calculations. She blinked at me, nodded once, and then, without warning, replicated the scene with a precision that involved spinning, flailing limbs, and knocking over a cup of tea, landing in a heap on the floor while still trying to maintain the pose. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or intervene first. She looked up, eyes shining, as if she had discovered a fundamental human truth. This is fascinating, she whispered. I wanted to agree, but I also wanted a helmet and a manual for alien etiquette. Her experiments didn't stop there. She discovered human underwear, and my life changed forever. Why do humans wear these? She asked one evening, holding up a pair of my boxer briefs. What is their function in human physiology? I froze, unsure how to respond without sounding inappropriate. They provide support, I said cautiously. She frowned, tilted her head, and then proceeded to try them on herself in some bizarre alien fashion, wrapping them around her arms and legs in ways that would have been physically impossible for a human. She floated in midair, muttering measurements and scribbling notes, like a scientist who had just discovered an entirely new species. The sight was so absurd that I collapsed onto the couch, half laughing, half groaning. It's not supposed to be worn that way, I managed to say, while she looked at me with the most innocent, serious expression imaginable, as if I were the one misunderstanding the garment entirely. The chaos spilled over into daily life. She would shadow me at the grocery store, poking at displays, asking why humans preferred certain foods, and occasionally attempting to taste test in ways that drew horrified glances from fellow shoppers. She tried to mimic human dating etiquette by approaching strangers and introducing herself with a literal bow, loudly announcing, "I am studying humans for cultural understanding." Some people smiled politely, others fled in panic. Meanwhile, I chased after her, apologizing profusely, trying to explain that she might want to, maybe, not do that. Each attempt to correct her behavior only created more misunderstandings. She would misinterpret warnings as challenges or instructions as rules to exaggerate. When I said, "You might want to give people space," she immediately began experimenting with social distance by floating exactly 6 inches above each person she passed, completely missing the point. Despite the chaos, there was something undeniably endearing in her commitment. Every misstep, every bizarre interpretation, was a glimpse into a mind that approached human intimacy and culture with the unfiltered sincerity of someone who truly wanted to understand. She asked questions about romantic gestures, the science of attraction, and the reasons humans blush, often turning these inquiries into absurd experiments. At one point, she tried to measure my heartbeat while I described my high school crushes, attaching small alien sensors to my chest and floating dangerously close to my face. "Fascinating," she said, scribbling notes, as if I were a living laboratory. I waved my hands frantically, trying to maintain dignity, while she remained oblivious to my discomfort, utterly absorbed in her research. By the time evening rolled around, my apartment had become a miniature chaos lab. Coffee cups were knocked over. Furniture had been slightly rearranged to suit her observational angles, and I had become both the assistant and unwitting subject in her relentless quest to decode human intimacy. And yet, even in the middle of the mess, there was a growing warmth between us. Her curiosity, though intrusive, was infused with innocence and charm. I realized that the more she tried to understand humans, the more I found myself fascinated by her intellect, her quirks, and the way she approached the world with relentless wonder. It was exhausting, embarrassing, and utterly hilarious, and I had no idea how much wilder it was going to get. Her adorable curiosity had crossed into dangerous territory, and the real challenge was only just beginning. Things reached a new level of chaos the moment she decided that observing human intimacy required practical demonstrations. I had hoped she would confine herself to questions and notes, but apparently, floating around with wide eyes and a holographic pad wasn't enough anymore. One evening, while I was innocently scrolling through my phone, she suddenly leaned over, her eyes glittering with excitement. "I need to see how humans express affection physically," she declared, as if this were just another routine observation. I swallowed hard, unsure whether to laugh, panic, or run for cover. Before I could respond, she launched herself into a series of exaggerated gestures, mimicking hugging, hand-holding, and even awkwardly attempting to replicate a kiss. Her limbs bent in impossible ways, flailing as she tried to get the angles right, and I found myself blocking her every move while simultaneously trying to explain. "No, that's not quite how humans do it." Her literal interpretations made everything more ridiculous. In one moment, she attempted to demonstrate emotional connection by clinging to my shoulders, spinning slightly in midair while humming a high-pitched note that sounded like a tuning fork. I tried to guide her down, but she floated just out of reach, scribbling frantic notes about my reactions. "Your facial muscles, fascinating," she said, pointing at my reddening cheeks. I groaned. "Yeah, that's called embarrassment," I muttered. She tilted her head, as if processing the word, and replied seriously. "Interesting. Must be linked to attraction chemicals. Must measure." Then she pulled out a tiny alien device that beeped and flashed, apparently trying to quantify my blush levels. The absurdity of it all nearly broke me. Her adorableness and intensity made it impossible to stay annoyed for long. Public outings were even worse. At the grocery store, she decided that observing human social bonding required interacting with strangers. She approached a young couple, extended her hands, and said, "I wish to study your bonding behaviors for research purposes," in a loud, melodic voice. The couple froze, clearly unsure if this was some performance art or a mental breakdown. I ran after her, apologizing and waving my hands like a lunatic. She's just curious," I tried to explain. The alien blinked, floated closer, and then proceeded to hug the bewildered pair simultaneously, making them stumble backward in confusion while she scribbled notes, as if the entire exchange were the pinnacle of scientific discovery. I buried my face in my hands, muttering, "How is this even legal?" Her curiosity about intimacy didn't stop at observation, it started to feel like playful experimentation. She tried to determine the optimal ways humans express attraction by enacting exaggerated scenes from romantic movies. One afternoon, she draped herself over the couch dramatically, attempting a romantic swoon, while I tried not to trip over her floating limbs as I corrected her posture. "The human male reacts with alarm and concern," she said, referencing me. "Not affection. Hypothesis invalid." I tried to suppress laughter as I explained that it was only a movie, but she wasn't satisfied. "No, you must participate in demonstration," she insisted, dragging me into a series of absurdly choreographed gestures. I stumbled, nearly knocking over a lamp, while she floated elegantly, clearly oblivious to physics, and I realized this was going to be the longest, most ridiculous evening of my life. Even my attempts at personal space became a comedy of errors. She wanted to measure how close humans can tolerate physical proximity, and proceeded to hover centimeters from my face for hours, muttering notes about pulse rate, breathing patterns, and involuntary facial twitches. I waved her away politely, but every explanation seemed to backfire. "You humans are so sensitive," she said, floating in a perfect arc around my living room. "Curious. I must record more data." I could feel the blush creeping up my neck, partially from embarrassment, and partially from the absurd thrill of her relentless curiosity. Somehow, in the midst of all the chaos, a small part of me was beginning to find her antics charming in ways I didn't expect. Amid the awkward experimentation, there were moments of unexpected connection. She began to notice patterns in my reactions, not just physical ones, but emotional ones. When I laughed, she tilted her head, clearly analyzing the sound and the movement of my lips. When I flinched at her intensity, she floated back slightly, scribbling furiously, then said softly, "I do not wish to overwhelm you. I wish to understand, properly." That single sentence, delivered with her musical lilt, managed to melt some of my tension. It was still awkward, absurd, and occasionally mortifying, but there was a sweetness underneath, a desire to connect and comprehend that went beyond simple observation. The adult comedy of errors reached a new level one night when she tried to enact what she called a full bonding ritual. She had gathered candles, a blanket, and a collection of objects she claimed were essential for human intimacy, though they were mostly random trinkets and half-broken gadgets from my apartment. She gestured for me to participate, floating midair like some kind of alien ceremonial guide. I tried to demur, but she grabbed my hand with surprising strength, her eyes wide and expectant. The result was a mix of tangled limbs, knocked over candles, and a near disaster with a teapot, but also laughter, unintentional flirtation, and moments of genuine closeness. Between the chaos and my exasperated commentary, I started to see that her curiosity, though invasive, had an odd kind of romance to it. By the end of the night, we were both exhausted, sprawled on the couch amidst the wreckage of her demonstration, and she looked at me with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. "You humans are complicated," she said softly, her eyes glimmering. I shook my head, laughing, trying to catch my breath. "You have no idea," I muttered. And as absurd and chaotic as it had been, I realized that in the middle of all her literal, over-the-top attempts to understand me, a spark had formed, awkward, hilarious, and undeniably romantic. She wasn't just an alien observer anymore. She was a companion, utterly bizarre and infuriating, but impossible not to love. Even in the chaos, I found myself fascinated by her fascination, and I knew the next chapter of this adventure was going to be even more ridiculous. The line between observation, curiosity, and flirtation had blurred entirely, leaving us teetering on the edge of hilarity and intimacy, and I had no idea how I was going to survive it. By the time evening rolled around, the apartment was a mess of scattered cushions, spilled drinks, and oddly positioned alien devices, each one blinking and beeping as if charting the course of my sanity. She floated in the center of it all, her luminous eyes wide and sparkling with the excitement of someone who had finally reached the climax of her research. "I believe I have collected sufficient data on human intimacy," she announced, her voice a melodic combination of pride and anticipation. I froze, unsure whether that was a relief or the prelude to some even more embarrassing demonstration. Before I could respond, she gestured at me with both hands, floating a few inches above the ground, and said, "Now we shall conduct the ultimate bonding ritual to test your responses for accuracy." My eyes nearly bulged. "Ultimate bonding ritual?" I echoed weakly, my voice barely hiding the panic rising in my chest. She had, predictably, taken every observation she had gathered over the past weeks and decided that combining them all into one grand display would yield the most accurate human results. Candles flickered precariously on every available surface, while a thin blanket had been strung across the living room to serve as some kind of ceremonial stage. Random objects from the apartment were carefully positioned as props, though what their purpose was remained a mystery to me. She floated in a perfect circle around the room, her limbs extended in ways that defied logic, muttering in her melodic tongue while I tried desperately to figure out how I had agreed to this and whether I should start negotiating my own safety. Despite the chaos, there was a strangely endearing logic to it. She was sincere in her approach, her curiosity unrelenting, and yet beneath the elaborate theatrics, there was a clear desire to connect with me. She gestured for me to sit on the blanket, and I hesitated, imagining all the ways I could embarrass myself or ruin the intricate setup. "It's okay," she said softly, her translator providing the closest approximation of reassurance. "This is necessary to understand human emotional bonding. You will participate willingly." I groaned, but there was no arguing with that level of determination. I stepped forward cautiously, my movements tentative, while she floated closer and handed me an assortment of strange trinkets, which she indicated were essential for participation. What followed was a mix of hilarity, embarrassment, and surprisingly tender moments. She guided me through an elaborate series of gestures that were meant to simulate affection and attraction, each movement punctuated with her meticulous commentary. "Now clasp hands as humans often do. Good. Excellent. Note the heartbeat acceleration, recorded." I struggled to maintain any semblance of dignity as she hovered inches from my face, eyes sparkling with excitement, occasionally flapping her arms for emphasis. I stumbled through the motions, knocking over a candle in the process, which she noted with an approving nod. Somehow, between the chaos and my awkward compliance, there was a rhythm developing, a strange, comedic intimacy that felt oddly genuine. As the ritual continued, I realized that her attempts, though wildly literal and absurd, were starting to feel less like invasive experiments and more like shared experiences. Every gesture she mimicked, every note she scribbled, seemed to draw us closer, despite the ridiculousness of it all. At one point, she floated directly above me, observing my reaction to a demonstration kiss, which I had to awkwardly mimic with exaggerated caution. Her eyes widened in fascination, and instead of panic, I found myself laughing uncontrollably at the spectacle we had created together. The humor was infectious, breaking down any lingering tension and replacing it with something warmer, something more intimate. Eventually, the flurry of gestures, notes, and floating antics came to a pause. She hovered above me, scanning my face with those wide, luminous eyes, and for the first time, I felt a genuine softness in her gaze. "I believe I understand humans better now," she said quietly. Her voice was almost shy, a stark contrast to the commanding enthusiasm of the past days. I smiled, exhausted but relieved, and nodded. "I think I've learned a lot too," I admitted, realizing that her relentless curiosity had taught me patience, humor, and the joy of sharing even the most awkward moments with someone who genuinely wanted to understand me. The final moments of the evening were tender in their own chaotic way. She reached out, attempting to hold my hand in her peculiar alien manner, fingers floating and twisting in ways that defied human anatomy, yet the gesture was unmistakably affectionate. I took her hand gently, laughing at the absurdity of the situation, while feeling an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with comedy or chaos. Her eyes sparkled as she mimicked a small, triumphant smile, clearly pleased with the outcome of her observations. For all the missteps, the misunderstandings, and the hilarity, there was a connection that had emerged, an understanding that transcended species, language, and logic. As I leaned back on the couch, the apartment still littered with the evidence of her curiosity, she floated beside me, humming softly and scribbling one last note. "Humans are extraordinary," she said. I laughed softly, reaching over to ruffle her hair, which shimmered faintly in the dim light. "You're not so bad yourself," I replied. In that moment, the chaos, the embarrassment, and the relentless curiosity felt less like obstacles and more like the foundation of something genuine, a playful, romantic bond built on humor, curiosity, and the willingness to navigate the absurd together. Even as she asked one final, slightly awkward question about something entirely private, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this strange, unpredictable adventure was far from over. For the first time, her curiosity felt less like a challenge and more like an invitation to laugh, to connect, and to experience the strange, delightful chaos of humanity together. And somehow, despite the absurdity, it worked.